We'll now take a closer look here at the Christology in First Peter. So first of all, it's helpful to kind of take a look at how Peter understands the prophecy about the Messiah. According to First Peter 1, 10 through 12, the Spirit of Christ was in the Old Testament who predicted Jesus' death. So again, the Spirit of Christ is kind of an interesting phrase. We're not quite sure if this is an indication that Peter believed in Jesus' pre-existence. So this is obviously a big issue about the development of Christology. So from the book of Acts, what we can tell is that the early disciples certainly think of Jesus as Lord, as Messiah, but it's not evident that the earliest believers believed in the pre-existence of Jesus. So we do have language in the Gospels about Jesus saying, I have come to, but that phrase does not necessarily mean that Jesus had a pre-existence in the heavens. Now, of course, the Gospel of John has a very clear, straightforward idea that Jesus was pre-existent. Jesus is the Word of God, who was in the beginning with God. And so he becomes enfleshed in Jesus. So the idea of Jesus' pre-existence is very clear in the Gospel of John, and it may be clear as well in other places, such as in Philippians chapter 2. But in the Petrine material, it's not clear whether or not Peter holds this idea yet, that he already came to understand that Jesus was pre-existent. This is part of Peter's apology for the Messiah's crucifixion. By apology, we don't mean here in the sense that he's claiming to be sorry for it. The word apology basically means a defense. So when you make an apology, you are making a defense for something. And so here Peter is making a defense, an argument, as it were, why the Messiah ought to have been crucified, because that was not something expected by any Jew before the period of Christianity. So here Peter in this section is really making this statement that the prophets are anticipating what is going to happen to Jesus, and that Jesus' crucifixion was not some kind of accident of history. Peter did not work his way to Jesus by having read the prophets. In other words, Peter did not start following Jesus or come to believe in Jesus Messiah because he had read the prophets, but because he had experienced Jesus in his ministry as well as through the resurrection. He had come to experience that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, and then with that experience, he came to have a new understanding of the prophetic material. So, in other words, it wasn't read the prophets that leads you to Jesus. It is experience Jesus, now go and read the prophets. So as we read the prophets with Peter a little more, for Peter, Isaiah 52, 13 through chapter 53 and 12 is central to his Christology. And we've referred to this before when we looked at kind of the introduction to 1 Peter and the whole suffering servant motif. It may have started with Jesus himself. At least Luke 22:37 indicates Jesus made a connection with this. But it certainly became an early Christology of Hellenistic Jews, that is, of Greek-speaking Jews who came to recognize Jesus as Lord. So, for instance, with the Ethiopian eunuch Philip, who is a Greek-speaking Jew, begins to interpret the suffering servant material out of Isaiah and points it or directs it towards Jesus. And then this is later on followed by others. So Paul does this, and we find this in Matthew and in John's Gospel as well. And so we made this point earlier. Peter's distinctive use of this text in more detail also emphasizes Jesus' reaction to unjust punishment. So just like the suffering servant in Isaiah receives unjust treatment, so too Jesus did. And so therefore there's a kind of a connection between what Peter saw took place with Jesus and what Peter and others came to see was true of the suffering servant. Jesus' death bore sins. It took care of sins in some way. It was kind of an atonement for sins. It heals the wounds, the inflictions, the punishments that are given to Israel. And it also returns stray. So in other words, those who have wandered now because of Jesus' death can be brought back to God. So several different aspects of the suffering servant idea are now done. So in all of this, what we find is Jesus, like the suffering servant, he does not retaliate, he makes no threats, but instead he trusts in God. Now, and a very interesting question that comes out of a reading of 1 Peter is the question of whether or not Jesus went to hell. Now, first of all, what do we mean by hell? Well, our English word hell is used to translate a Greek word, Gehenna. And Gehenna is an expression that picks up this idea of a valley of Hinnom. And this valley of Hinnom is this kind of place in the Old Testament that is associated with idolatrous practice. It's associated with the offer of children in burnt sacrifices. So it is a place of abomination. It is a place of disobedience. So in Jewish apocalyptic material, hell becomes this place where final punishment is rendered, where the wicked are cast. And so you see this idea a lot in Matthew's gospel, where the wicked and the devil and his angels are cast in final judgment in hell. Hell is the place that is reserved for final condemnation. It's not the place where people go to as soon as they die, but it's the place where all the dead who are wicked, when they are raised, will be cast. And it's the place where disobeying spirits are thrown to. Now, in the 4th century, what's known as the Apostles' Creed claimed that Jesus descended into hell. Now, there is the idea of the infernos. But interesting question that needs to be raised is, by this word infernos, or hell, is that the same thing as what we mean today by going to hell? Did they have the same idea with infernos as what we mean by going to hell, or what is oftentimes thought of as the Jewish kind of apocalyptic understanding of hell? One question sometimes is raised: could the idea of infernos mean the grave? And did the Apostles' Creed intend to imply that when Jesus descended, what he descended into was not this place of punishment, but did he descend into the grave? Did he descend into that realm of the dead? Clement of Alexandria thought so, as did Origen and Cyril of Alexandria, but Augustine didn't. So we see in the early church, at least in the kind of the patristic period, kind of a division between church writers about whether or not Jesus actually descended into hell, this place of punishment. And so it's not kind of a unanimous decision. And so our question is, did Peter think that this happened? So in 1 Peter chapter 3, there's an interesting section in verses 18 through 22. And in particular, we want to draw attention to what is said in chapter 3 in verse 17. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering could be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were saved through water. So it's this idea of Jesus descending to the spirits in prison that some have thought, well, this is an indication that Peter thought that Jesus descended into hell. So who then are these imprisoned spirits, and where are they? Well, one idea is probably that these spirits are the kind of the fallen sons of God in Genesis 6, 2, and 4 through 5. So it's not indicated that in Genesis 6 that these sons of God are punished by being cast into some kind of netherworld, but the idea is present in other Jewish works, such as First Enoch, where there are these imprisoned spirits kind of connected to these sons of God. And so maybe First Peter has been influenced by this idea, and he thinks of Christ as going to these spirits and kind of proclaiming, preaching, announcing what has occurred to them. This is not a preaching of salvation. It is not preaching in order that they might respond and then get out, but it is an announcement of what God has been doing. Others said, well, maybe it's not hell. Maybe what we're really talking about is Hades or Sheol. So in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, there is a Hebrew word called Sheol. This word can be translated in different ways, but it has this idea of a pit. It can be the idea of a grave. But the Sheol in the Old Testament is the idea of a netherworld in where all people, whether you're good or bad, everybody goes to Sheol. Everybody goes to the grave. It's not a place where you praise God. It's just a sad existence. So the idea in the Old Testament is primarily that you want to live. You want to be obedient to God's law and continue to live. You don't want to die. But a change took place so that Jews began to think of a positive afterlife even after one's death. Now, this did not take place until sometime after their captivity, and likely during the kind of the Persian period. So somewhere in the 5th, 4th century BC, Jews began to start thinking about a more positive afterlife, and we see this become more fully entrenched in the 3rd century BC. So the word Sheol, the Hebrew word Sheol, in Greek gets translated with this idea of Hades. So, for instance, in Luke's Gospel, it talks about the Lazarus and the rich man. Well, the rich man goes to Hades. He goes to the Hadean world. Actually, also does the Lazarus. Both Lazarus and the rich man are in the Hadean world, though Lazarus is in the Hadean world of comfort. He's in Abraham's bosom. Or it could be described as paradise. This is what Jesus says to the thief on the cross. Today you'll be with me in paradise. So a part of the Hadean world has a good place, and then a part of the Hadean world has a place of punishment. So the rich man goes to that part of the Hadean world where he is punished. So it may be that here in 1 Peter, what he has in mind is Jesus going to the Hadean world. This is the prison, as it were, where the good and the bad are kept. And there Jesus goes and makes a proclamation about what God has done to those who are dead but who exist in this world. So a lot of people are wondering maybe what role First Enoch is playing in Peter's text, and particularly that First Enoch 15:16 that I mentioned earlier. And so again, this kind of like when we looked at the book of Jude, Jude seems to be influenced by First Enoch. Here too, it may be that First Peter is influenced by First Enoch. And so what does this say then about the way in which these authors thought of this material, and particularly here these ideas of disobeying spirits who are then punished by God? So it leaves an open question. It's not quite clear for my own view. I don't think that Jesus goes to hell. I think Jesus does go to the Hadean world. He goes to the place of the dead. That's why he told the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." But hell is saved for the future judgment. It's not really a place that individuals go to once they die. Another aspect of the Christology in 1 Peter we want to make mention of is the idea of Jesus as a sacrificial lamb. Jesus is a lamb without blemish or defect. Now, we're not quite sure what lamb this is. Is it a Passover lamb that he has in mind? The tradition that connects Jesus to a sacrificial lamb is found in several New Testament authors. It's found in Paul, it's found in John, it's found in Hebrews. The problem with it being a Passover lamb is that a Passover lamb is not really a sacrificial lamb that atones for sins. And if you're thinking of Jesus as an atoning sacrifice, the Passover lamb is not really the lamb to be thinking about. The sacrifice of Jesus is meant to produce people who change from a kind of empty life to hope and faith in God. And so it's a sacrifice, whatever its role in sacrifice, is supposed to have an effect upon the way in which people live. And as we mentioned as well in a previous podcast, kind of as an introduction to this Christology, Jesus is a living stone. 1 Peter calls Jesus a living stone. He's precious to God, though rejected by humans. And this is Isaiah's cornerstone, and it causes people to stumble. Now, sometimes there's a bit of a question about what's meant as a cornerstone. Is this an idea of a first stone that is laid in the foundation, and so from which all the rest of the foundation stones then are kind of leveled against? Or is this some other kind of foundation stone that has in mind? So the idea of foundation stone or cornerstone is left unclear. Believers have been constructed as living stones themselves into a new Israel. And all of this is done really for the praise of God for his mercy. So the Christology of 1 Peter is very much focused not only on what Jesus' death has done in terms of bringing people into a relationship with God, but it's also very much attuned that into a Christology that focuses on the effect of Jesus' death upon the way in which believers live in a world that treats them with harassment or treats them with oppression, treats them with injustice, that Jesus' sacrifice is supposed to change them into living in a new way and understanding that despite what circumstances might indicate, they have been treated with mercy from God. And so that gives us a little more background into the Christology of 1 Peter's